as to where I think the global food system is headed. I have some recommendations, Chairman. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share my biases or my perspectives as to where I think the global food system is headed. I have some recommendations as to what could be done to make sure it's headed in the right direction, but many of those coincide with what Schengen Fan was saying this morning, so I can go through those real quick. Just goes to show that the former and current directors of IFPRI agree on what the world should look like if they would just, the world would just leave it to us to get it done. If we're going to talk about where the food system is headed, it's good to just take a look at where we've been, and this is just one illustration. If you extrapolate a straight line, you get into the future, you get a continuation of the straight line, and that's exactly what we thought was happening up until the so-called food crisis, that the number of hungry people stayed roughly constant since 1990, and of course the blue line that you see is the wishful thinking that came out of the World Food Summit, hoping that the world could reduce by half the number of hungry people. That doesn't look like it's possible. Situation is even worse in sub-Saharan Africa, as you all know. But I want to refer to some work that Daryl Watson, who is in the audience, has done, which shows that almost all of the increase in the number of hungry people in sub-Saharan Africa comes from changes in Congo. Most of the African countries have not seen a significant change in the number of hungry people since 1990, as I understand this, the outcome of this research, which means that some of those countries may well achieve the Millennium Development Goal, not the World Food Summit goal, the Millennium Development Goal to reduce by half the percentage that was discussed this morning, simply by keeping the number of hungry people constant and making sure they have a high population growth rate. That's not exactly what we had in mind, I'm sure, when we put these goals into place, but that may well be one of the outcomes. Then, of course, something happened that we've been talking about already, we all know about, namely rapid increases in the world food prices. I'm showing this FAO diagram because the changes took place so rapidly during certain periods of time that it's good to have monthly data. And if you look at 2007, you see a dramatic increase which continued into the beginning of 2008, and then you saw a dramatic decrease during the second half of 2008. We're all familiar with these price trends. That resulted, according to the statistics that are issued by FAO, in an increase in the number of hungry people by about 170 million during that period, from about 850 to more than 1 billion, and we heard these numbers this morning. I do not believe those numbers. The number of poor people may well have gone up by that amount, but it would not be because of the international price changes, and I'll come back and try to justify that argument. Same thing was argued for sub-Saharan Africa. There was a dramatic increase because of the international price increases, and again, I don't believe that is true. Here's one reason why I don't believe it's true. The price transmission between the international prices and the national prices is very low in those countries that have poor infrastructure, that are not very well integrated in the international market. And the price transmission is also very low in countries such as China, that is reasonably well integrated, but decides to put in place policies to make sure that the price transmission was not very significant. And that is what you see in the case of China, and this is what you see in the case of India, which I actually thought I had a slide on that, but it looks like maybe coming back to that. Pardon? India is there, but I have something slightly more dramatic, Nora, but maybe this is dramatic enough. So what this shows, of course, is the wholesale rice price in US dollars per ton. And if you look at the pink, the top spike, that's the international prices reflected by the price in Thailand. In fact, the Philippines entered into contracts in Thailand for rice at a price above $1,000 a ton at some point during that period panic. So you see India with some increase in rice prices, but not very much, and we all know why that was. They put in place some trade policies that pretty much made it impossible to export rice during a certain period of time. Those policies are still in place, but now they have more favorable kinds of arrangement with the countries that they would like to export rice to on a case-by-case basis. Look at China again, there was very little price increase. Then you look at Egypt and the Philippines, of course, where you had very large price transmissions from the international market. Now here's the thing. If in fact there were no more poor people in China and India because of the international food price increases, that 170 million increase had to come from the rest of the world. That means huge increases in the other countries, because remember, India and China are responsible for a very large share of the world population. This is another illustration of the kind of lack of price transmission that we saw. In Egypt, the prices of wheat went up dramatically during that period, not because of international price increases, but because of national policies. You look at the yellow curve shows the international prices, and the top one is from Egypt, where you saw dramatic increases, not because of the international, the international price increases. One other slide, which is for maize or corn, if you like that term better. Wholesale maize prices in Kenya went up with the international prices, but didn't come back down, stayed up there for reasons other than international prices, for national reasons. And we have people here from Kenya who can talk more about this. Another thing that's happening is that many countries, in spite of this low price transmission, many countries are becoming concerned about relying on international food trade. I mean, after all, in countries like the Philippines, the rice price pretty much determines who wins the next election. And food prices are really important components in many countries. So countries are moving towards self-sufficiency, less dependency. We talked about reserve stocks already. This shows some of the global grain stock buildup during a certain period of time, from when the international prices began to go up and until very recently. Rice went up by 25%, wheat by 24%, maize by 17% during the last 3 years. So there's been a huge stock buildup. And the other thing, of course, that's happening, which we already talked about, is many middle-income countries who are food deficit, and some of the international corporations that are in this business as well, are trying to gain control over land, what we normally refer to in slang as land grabbing, trying to get control over the production resources, particularly land, in low-income countries that supposedly have excess agricultural land available. I say supposedly because it is not entirely clear what's happening. Even the World Bank seemed to be unable to get governments to give them the kind of information they need to fully understand what's happening in these deals. This is another illustration of coming back to the stock level that China, of course, has built up very, very large stocks of wheat and rice during the last few years, and so has India. At least I get one dramatic picture from India, missed the other one. See a dramatic increase in grain stocks in India. My understanding is that recently those stocks have fallen somewhat, but they're still much larger than they were just a few years ago. Now, what are some of the food system challenges? And again, Chen Fan talked about most of these this morning, so I can go through them real quickly. There's still a lack of commitment in developing countries, lack of commitments to agriculture. There's no lack of commitment to talking about it and to writing about it. There is a terrible lack of commitment in putting the plans into action. So that is something we still suffer from. The adverse perceptions of agriculture in developed countries are still with us, even though, again, the talk is moving towards agriculture as being important, but not in my backyard kind of thing because it's going to ruin the environment. That seems to be the argument in much of the European debate, for sure. Increasing water scarcity, soil degradation, climate change, low productivity. We talked about all of these things, poor rural infrastructure and poorly functioning markets. We already talked about that. Rapid increases in market concentration, whether it's at the retail level with supermarket chains, growing dramatically in many developing countries, but also in the wholesale chain. That, of course, changes the relative power structure in the food system. And we've got a set of demand factors that we need to pay close attention to. Population is still growing, just in case you thought we had solved that problem. We will be more than 9 billion people probably by 2050, so there is still considerable population growth, and that translates into increasing demand for food. There's a very strong dietary transition going on out there in the real world, with increasing demand for high-value crops, livestock products, and so on. And of course, that derives with it the increasing demand for feed. We talked about biofuel already, and we talked about the closer link between food and oil prices. We talked about land grabbing. What are some of the opportunities now that we talk about the challenges? We got a lot of attention by policymakers to the food crisis. But that attention so far has been turned into talk and papers more than actual action. Will we be able to maintain that attention long enough so we can actually get some serious action? That is, it seems to me, at this point, an open question. There's now some writing that says, well, maybe agriculture really isn't the driving force in low-income countries. Maybe we should pursue some other avenues, which I think is a very dangerous kind of direction that the debate is taking. Modern science moves ahead in spite of the opposition by certain groups who thinks that science is part of the problem rather than part of the solution. It is moving ahead. Tremendous opportunities have not been utilized. Expanding investment in public goods. We talked about this morning. I want to say a few more things later about internalizing environmental costs into private costs. I think that market failure, or that externality, if that's the term you like to use, we have to confront at some point if we're really serious about sustainable development or sustainable food systems. We can't continue to talk about sustainability without trying to correct that market failure. And we have not been very good at doing that. I'll come back to that in a minute. And of course, improved policies and institutions, having been affiliated with IFPRI, how can I not add that? Shenyan, I believe you covered all of these things that I call priority number one, so I'm not going to spend more time on it because I've seen this big red card that the chairman has over there. Priority number two, a doubling of public investment in agriculture, research and technology, focusing on the sustainability questions. We need to produce more, but we need to do it sustainably. No, it's not a question of whether to protect the natural resources or produce more. We can have both. We can have both, and we're going to have both. And I'm going to come back to that a little later. We need research. We need research to deal with the biotic and abiotic stresses, all the kinds of things that, again, we've talked about and we'll talk some more about. And we need to take the relationship between the food system and climate change seriously, as we have already done this morning. We need to try to get governments to make investments that will facilitate the private sector doing its job efficiently and appropriately. And that means, among other things, savings and credit institutions for farmers, because remember, farmers are in most countries part of the private sector. It means risk management tools for farmers. It means public goods investments. You cannot get the private sector to operate efficiently if the public goods are missing, if the feeder roads are not there. if the research isn't being done, the research that is needed to produce the public goods part of the technology, and a number of other things, such as education and primary health care. One of the things that we need to try to get governments to do is to strengthen the purchasing power of small farmers so that they can convert their technology needs and their input needs into market demand. If that can be done, then the private sector will step in, because most of those inputs are not public goods, they're private goods. They can be produced by the private sector, but only if the private sector has a market for them. So that means capital formation in rural areas among smallholders. It means credit programs. It means savings institutions. Yes, we have microcredit schemes, and they are wonderful where they work, and they work for the poorest of the poor, but they don't work very well for mid-level or smaller commercial farmers, and they weren't, I think, meant to work for them anyway. We can set up competitive funds which can be used to pay for the technology that the private sector can develop. There are a number of things that can be done to create the market that the private sector is going to need in order to do its job and produce the private goods. We need best practices for the activities that are usually classified as land grabbing. And there are some best practices being developed now by FAO, the World Bank, and some other institutions. I'm working with a colleague at Cornell on finishing a paper on this, and she sent me an email, said, in the shower this morning, it occurred to me, who is going to enforce these best practices? And that's a wonderful question, because right now we have no international institution that will enforce those best practices. They are guidelines, they are voluntary. Full costing. And here I'm coming back to what I was talking about before, namely, we need to make sure that farmers are being, and the food system agents are being paid for the ecosystem services that they perform, and that they pay for the ecosystem damage that they do. Somehow we need to put some prices on these non-market factors so that we can move towards sustainable management of natural resources. We tried to do this in my country, Denmark. We tried to talk about it in my country, Denmark. We have green taxes and so on. I have colleagues from Denmark who know much more about this. But when it came to a discussion about whether we should put a tax on cows because they are emitting methane, which is a nasty thing for global warming, then of course the farmers said, if we do that, we go out of business. And they are probably right. So the point I'm making here is we need international agreements if this is going to work. And if we can't get international agreement, I don't think we can get sustainable food systems. And the way things are going right now, I'm not very optimistic that we can get international agreements. And I'm talking not just about cows. I happen to like cows. I eat meat. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm talking about the broader concepts of incorporating these externalities into the private costs and, of course, passing on the cost to the consumer. That we can't really do unless we get international agreements. We need to get clarity on water and land tenure. Very, very important, both from the perspective of productivity increases and from the perspective of sustainability. And let me mention also that many of these land-grabbing deals that are being made between say an African government and a multinational corporation representing maybe Saudi Arabia or China. Many of these deals claim that they are giving control of land that is not cultivated. There is nobody on that land. That is not generally true. There are people on that land and they are not consulted, and they're probably going to be pushed aside when the capital-intensive production methods are introduced from the outside. And I think I said at the outside, at the beginning, at the outset, I was going to share biases. That is clearly one of my biases. Because there is no clear tenure to much of that land, governments can, in fact, do things like that. I mentioned earlier that we don't have to choose between protecting the environment or producing more food. We can have both. Does that mean 5 minutes or no minutes?
No minutes,
No
so
minutes.
you put in the last.
I was afraid of that. Okay, I'm sorry I asked. So let me just say a couple of things about win-win-win, and then I'll be done. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with the environmental Kuznets curve. If you start between where stage 1 ends and stage 2 begins up there, and you take the top line, that's the environmental Kuznets curve. What Darrell Watson and I have been working on is stage 1. And stage 1, of course, is a win-win and possibly a win-win-win. In other words, if you can make available more organic matter, more fertilizer, or some other way of reducing soil mining, you will, in fact, improve the land quality, you will, in fact, increase productivity, and you will, in fact, reduce poverty. That stage 1 we couldn't find in any of the literature that we reviewed. And it seems to me that that's something that requires a lot more research so that we simply get away from the idea that just because the environmental Kuznets curve may work for air pollution, it may not work for soil mining and deforestation. And I could talk much more about that, as could Darrell, but the chairman won't let me. These are the future perspectives. Significant supply responses. We've seen it already. We had the biggest harvest we ever had, I believe, last year, and this year it's going to be almost as big. Farmers actually do respond to prices, and so do governments by investing more. The increasing land grabbing, it looks like that's on an upward trend. I'm probably the only one in this room who thinks that the real food prices are going to be on a falling trend, but I really do believe that, and we'll be glad to discuss that if we have time. We're clearly going to have increasing price volatility. We're going to have a strong but less strong link between oil and food prices than we had before, and again, I can go in and talk more about that later on if we have time. Unfortunately, the urban bias is probably not going to go away, and if things go as I see, governments of many developing countries are going to go back to complacency, and so are the development donors. And that, I'm sorry to end on such a negative note. Thank you.